Welcome. My name is Manuel Roman Lacayo. I am the Associate Director and current Acting Director for the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. It is my pleasure to welcome the panelists today for the 5th Charlemos date. Today's topic is both drugs and violence, Mexico and beyond. We have the pleasure of having Sandra Ley and Guillermo Trejo. And the charla will be moderated by Fabrice from the University of North Carolina. Thank you very much, Fabrice.
Okay. Hola, Sandra and Guillermo. Welcome to Charlemos. And let me welcome our audience to Charlemos number 5. I'm delighted to speak here with two old friends about their brand new book. It's been out for less than 2 weeks, published by Cambridge University Press. And the book is called Votes, Drugs, and Violence, The Political Logic of Criminal Wars in Mexico. Guillermo teaches at the University of Notre Dame. Sandra teaches at CIDE in Mexico City, where the three of us met more than a couple of years ago, I have to say. And in reflecting on your book, congratulations. First of all, this is a major effort, I think, both for many fields of social science research. And I guess the first question I'd like to ask the two of you is, those of us who hear the news, who hear about this massacre in Mexico, or the police have conquered or defeated this gang, if you could give us maybe a brief timeline of the key just high points of the drug war to situate all of us in this conversation.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's great to cross paths again, Fabrice. Thank you so much. I would say that probably the discussion on the drug war in Mexico tends to begin in 2006, right when former President Felipe Calderón declared the war on drug cartels. And that's usually what we get to hear, and 2006 seems to mark a lot of things of this discussion in general. However, as we argue in this book, the logic of criminal violence began to occur since the mid-1990s as part of party alternation that began to take place across the country. And it increased further after Mexico's transition to democracy in the year 2000. So, and of course, the spike of violence occurred after 2006, and that's why we start to speak a lot about violence after 2006. But there's a story before that we'd like to highlight in this book, the reason why part of the reason why we see this spike of violence is associated with Calderón's militarized strategy that prioritized the decapitation of drug cartels. And not only did we see a spike in homicides, but also diversification in many other criminal activities, from extortion to disappearances and resource extraction. And so this leads us also to talk about a specific type of violence that took off after 2006, 2007, that has to do with attacks by organized crime against public authorities and party candidates. I would say that those are probably like the main trends and points in time that we highlight in this book. But of course, there are other periods that we would like to talk about too, Guillermo.
Okay.
Yeah, I would add that just building on what Sandra said, that if we think about Mexico's drug wars, historians currently are doing incredible work analyzing the 1970s, which was the first major drug war that took place simultaneously with the Dirty War. So the 1970s in Mexico was a very charged period of anti-insurgency operations, and also simultaneously the Mexican state launched a major drug war, the Plan Condor, which has little to do with the South American Plan Condor. It's a different type of Plan Condor, but it had similar types of effects, similar types of atrocities, because the military, which was deeply involved not only in suppressing insurgents, was also deeply involved in rearranging criminal markets, and elite members of the military fighting this anti-insurgency war got deeply involved in the initial rise of Mexican drug cartels in the 1970s and 80s. We pick up at the end of where historians are looking into the long 60s, which is 65 to 85. In 85, there was a major change in Mexico's coercion practices. A lot of this was decentralized to the state level. The police, rather than the military, the state level police became a crucial actor, both of repression, but also protecting drug cartels. So what we analyze, as Sandra said, is the long period that goes from 89, 1990 to 2012. And between 89, 1990 to 2006, it's a long period in which the Mexican state did not have a war against the cartels, but it's a long period of inter-cartel wars. Battle deaths, approximately on average 250 battle deaths. So most people don't ignore or overlook these inter-cartel wars between 1990 and 2006. And then a central part of the book is what Sandra was saying. Once the state, first Fox and then Calderon more actively, they declare war on the cartels. And Mexico begins a period of state cartel, inter-cartel wars that stretches up to today. The book analyzes centrally the 2006-2012 period, has something to say in the conclusion about the Peña Nieto period, and we'll be happy to say something about the more current period.
Okay, so if I'm hearing there are three periods, sort of the 2006 to present, the 10, 15 years before that, and then you've mentioned a period even before that. And that leads, I guess, to my next question, the thought I had. What makes Mexico's experience unique, and what makes it, say, very relevant, very comparable to what's going on throughout Latin America and even other parts of the world?
So part of our argument refers to the conditions that enabled criminal violence. And we refer to, these conditions refer to a country transition into democracy, but these conditions in which there is a weak rule of law, broadly speaking, and a lack of extensive security sector reforms that enable authoritarian practices to extend and to become intertwined with democracy. And this has been the case not only of Mexico, but of other cases that in fact we briefly describe in the initial theoretical chapter for book, like Brazil or Honduras, where we also see criminal violence taking place, criminal wars with a major spike in recent years. However, I guess a question that always comes up is why organized crime organized crime activity sometimes is more violent than in other places, right? Why is it that in Mexico we're seeing this desire to establish controls over politics, over economies, over local societies being so violent, right? What we call criminal governance, whereas perhaps in Brazil, sometimes it doesn't seem as violent as we have seen in some parts in northern Chihuahua or in Guerrero. To this, we must say that there is a wide variation in terms of how these criminal governance regimes play out and how they are being organized. Depending on what we argue is that it greatly depends on the level of competition that they have among criminal groups, but also vis-a-vis the state. And so in Mexico, what we're seeing is a high confrontation on both ends, both among criminal groups and with the state. And that, in fact, is part of why we see these criminal governance regimes being so violent. However, the fact that we perhaps don't see as much violence in other parts in Latin America, for example, when we speak of specific places where perhaps in cases in Colombia or some cases in Brazil, it might not seem as violent. It doesn't seem that they're not predatory, that there is a lot of suffering going on by civilians in these communities that are greatly trapped, right? They're trapped. There's a lot of things that cannot be done, that cannot be said. So the fact that we don't see violence doesn't mean that there's not violent practices going on, right? So in many ways, there are, as you say, there are similarities, there are differences, But I think that in general, we're speaking of organized crime, strategic decisions, along intertwined with also strategic decisions by politicians. I guess those are things that I would stress out and why we're studying here.
Okay.
Just to complement quickly on this, just building on what Sandra is arguing, what I would say is that in terms of what's unique and what's different between Mexico and the rest of Latin America, I think one of the key contributions of the book is to really get back to basics, to rethink many of the concepts that we typically use in the study of criminal violence, because what we're seeing, as Sandra was saying, this is large-scale criminal violence. These are criminal wars that set some of Latin American countries into another level. So a lot of what we know from the sociology of crime, the economics of crime, is not as useful to understand this. And one of the key concepts that we introduce here, and I think it's important to understand where Mexico fits, is a new understanding of organized crime as an ecosystem of relationships in which criminal groups actively engage with state agents, and more specifically with repressive state agents. So this is a book about the deep engagement that happens between members of the military, members of the police, members of the Secret Service, with criminal groups. And these network relationships give rise to what we call the gray zone of criminality, where organized crime happens. And many of these relationships, although not exclusively, but often emerge in autocracies. And as Sandra was saying, one of the key questions, and this is one of the key contributions of the book, and this is the scope condition of the book, because if you transition to democracy and address the repressive practices of the military and the police and the judicial system that enables these repressive practices and the corruption and the criminality, if you engage those at the time of transition through security sector reform or transitional justice processes, countries are less likely to experience the levels of violence that Mexico experiences today. But if you are a country like Mexico, and this is the big scope condition of the book, Sandra mentioned Brazil, Honduras, we should say El Salvador, to some extent Guatemala, countries that transition to democracy and either ignore a repressive past, had no transitional justice processes, no security sector reform, no reform of the judiciary. This is what Terry Lynn Carlin in the 1990s called electoralism. This is what other scholars later on call illiberal democracies. If you transition from authoritarian rule to an illiberal democracy like Mexico did, like Brazil did, like Honduras did, like El Salvador did, like other countries did, these are countries that are most likely to see what Sandra was saying, the development of these intertwined relationships between electoral mechanisms and violence. So electoral competition becomes a trigger of violence. Party alternation becomes a trigger of violence. Political decentralization becomes a trigger of violence. Party fragmentation, political plurality, many of the elements that we deeply associate with democracy in a country, an illiberal democracy like Mexico, these become triggers of violence, and that's part of the tragedy. So other countries that transition to illiberal democracy could learn from Mexico. It's not the same story, it's not the same mechanisms, but some of those mechanisms become activated depending on the different institutions that countries may have.
I really want to emphasize something I hear both of you telling me and that I've picked up from the advanced proofs of the book, is that certain types of transitions away from authoritarianism, to use some older language in comparative politics, unless there's some sort of tackling of the topic of transitional justice, what both of you are suggesting create the basis for these enormous waves of criminal violence that we see in Mexico, certain Central American countries, and perhaps to a lesser extent in other parts of the world. And I want to return to that in our conversation. But I guess at this point, one of the things I want to do is, why did the two of you decide to study not political violence, perhaps, but criminal violence? What was it that motivated the two of you to do this, and then perhaps to work together? I think our audience would be curious. I'm curious.
Thanks, Fabrice. That's a great question because it's part of how you keep on going with this kinds of long-term projects. One of the things, this project started somewhere, or I mean, the idea of writing this book, just in general, started somewhere around 2008, 2009. At both an academic and personal level, Guillermo and I were far away from Mexico and looking at all this violence that was taking place. And we're really trying to make sense of why was this happening? Why was there also more violence in some places than in others in Mexico? Why was it seems in some places to be out of control? And this was particularly puzzling, as Guillermo was saying, because after the democratic transition, that having had expected so much, right? Having seen all this process of the democratization, party alternation, decentralization, how come we were looking so many people dying day after day, and all we saw was all these numbers going up every day in every single newspaper, what they call ejecutómetro. So every day we would have a new number, right? And it was almost like a competition of who had the highest number and whether that made sense or not. And so for us, that was part of the, I think it was part of the motivation to understand what is really going on. Do we have numbers to say something about this? At the time, we didn't have the Mexican government wasn't releasing any kind of information about this. So it was a part of a desperation of saying, we need to make sense of this and we need to do something about this and understand what is going on. It was puzzling to see that some of the places where democratization had started, right? Like Baja California, Chihuahua, Nuevo León, those places that we knew had been, right, like the first leaders in the democratization process, bottom-up process in Mexico, now we're facing a spike of violence. It was just so puzzling, right, and concerning. And we would see Guillermo had this course on organized crime as part of a graduate course, and we were looking at explanations from economists and criminologists and sociologists, and it seemed like perhaps it wasn't enough, or there was something that political science could say about that, right? For me, at a personal level, I was also very concerned about what are people doing about this? How are they responding? Can they do something about it? And so as a political scientist, my personal agenda has been on the political reactions to criminal violence. But to understand those effects, I had to understand the logic of criminal violence and the political logic of it. So being able to work with Guillermo has been an honor and a delight to understand this and learn jointly in such a complex phenomenon, I would say.
And you, Guillermo?
I mean, I would say I would completely echo this sense of shock that Sandra is describing, that affected, I think, many Mexicans in the between 2008, 2011, at one of the major peaks of this violence. And for the audience, I would just share a few numbers.
Please.
So that we understand the subtitle, the concept of criminal wars, because these are state forces, mostly the military, the police fighting against cartels, and cartels fighting one another, but multiple breakaway groups, multiple criminal groups. So including the private militias of the cartels. So these are very complex phenomena. If you want to understand the narco by just thinking about narcos and a family clan, that's very misleading. You're thinking about perhaps the 1980s. These are complex networks of family clans that collude deeply with state agents, but that also create their own private militias from former defectors of the military or the police, and who are also protected by incumbent members of the military and the police. So all these multiple conflicts produce lots of violence, many forms of violence that really shocked us. We're speaking just between 2006 and 2018, 150,000 battle deaths. The period that we study, approximately 70,000 battle deaths between 2006, 2012. 150. If you fast forward by the end of the administration, this current administration, that where we're going, Mexico is going to surpass Guatemala, a country that experienced 36-year civil war with 200,000, approximately 200,000 battle deaths. Well, Mexico will be far beyond that. So more than 80,000 people missing in the past 12 years. So that's far more than any dictatorship and most civil wars in Latin America. Levels of forced displacement between 350,000 and up to 8 million, depending on how you measure this.
Yeah, yeah.
So we're speaking about a magnitude of violence, different forms of violence, femicides, people missing, what Sandra was also saying, other forms of control, extraction, extortion, kidnapping for ransom. So this is a major explosion that had us as social scientists, but also as citizens of Mexico. Just, it was such a shocking wake-up call. And Mexico has been trapped at that. These levels of violence that Sandra said, if you look into the economics of crime, the sociology of crime, they really provide us with some tools, some elements to understand this. But yeah, like many other people since, I would say, Desmond Arias in 2005 to the present, it's a great group, multi-generational, multinational, looking into these dynamics, not just empirically, but also theoretically and conceptually. We need to get back to the board to rethink the politics of organized crime. We're gonna just assume that politics matters. We need to theorize it, but also test it. You know, in the end, politics is always a testable proposition to the extent that we were able to provide lots of evidence, observational analysis, quasi-experimental analysis, qualitative case studies, to really show that alongside other factors that Sandra has mentioned, politics matters, it's a trigger of violence. And I think for us, one of the big questions is how do you remove politics from this? How do you make elections a mechanism of accountability and not elections a trigger of violence?
I think perhaps we could explore this notion a bit more, because I think in one sense, many of us would agree, to the extent that the state loses its monopoly of coercion, then all types of violence, even something like criminal violence, becomes political. But I get the sense that two of you want to say something more ambitious than that. So maybe it would be helpful for the audience if you lay out a little bit, some of the evidence, just a tiny bit of the evidence, but the mechanism linking, say something is, at first glance, so distant from this as electoral-politics. How does that play into this?
Yeah, so perhaps before going into those empirics, yeah, I would like to highlight that the book also tries to make a contribution in terms of theory, right? We're building on a political theory of criminal violence, where we aim to redefine some terms and concepts that perhaps we've given for granted, like the state or organized crime, but we try to understand state so that we can define also what is organized crime, and consequently understand how both state and organized crime intertwine into what we call the gray zone of criminality. So that is part of how we're able to build into a series of arguments and empirics also. I guess I would highlight three main findings going into the question that you're asking us, Fabrice, on the logic of elections and how it plays out in terms of criminal violence. One of the first main finding I would say is it has to do with subnational party alternation, right? As many scholars studying democratization, in particular for Mexico, we've seen how the democratization process in Mexico was a bottom-up process, right? And how that led to the building of the big transitional process in 2000. What we observed is that subnational party alternation led to the breakdown of protection networks that were able to, that enable organized crime to operate with major impunity, right? When those networks broke down, there was uncertainty, and for organized crime groups, they were vulnerable, and this led to the creation of private militias. Organized crime groups cannot survive a single day without protection. They need protection, they need information in order to do their daily criminal activities. So this led to major escalation in inter-cartel wars, and that's what we see prior to 2006. But once we are in 2006, and that's when we're seeing Calderon making this decision, of course there was violence that had been rising. But in a context, as we have already emphasized, of an illiberal democracy and amid a great political polarization, as had occurred in 2006, right, between the left and the right, fighting after such a highly contested election, the most contested election in Mexican electoral history, with the left confronting the right, the PAN, right, about this electoral victory. That's the context in which Felipe Calderon decides to go into war. And so this political division was permeated the whole decision and the whole militarized strategy. And it actually led to the containment of violence in PAN-led states, while leading to the escalation of violence in PRD-led states. So right states were able to contain violence in contrast to the left side.
But now I'll just say this is fascinating. So this is one way of politics.
So just on that, Fabrice, just to extend the story a little bit, I think one of the most shocking lessons is that in this country in which there was a transition to electoral democracy, a thin transition, but no change in how the judiciary is controlled by the president and can be politicized. So you had opposition presidents from the PAN and now a leftist president who very much control the judiciary, the military, the judiciary and the police. So you did not change any of those institutions. And by the time Calderon launched the war on drugs, not only did we see what Sandra was describing, the politicization of the deployment of the army. So many scholars of Mexican drug violence have shown that there's been a causal impact of Gustavo Flores Macias, for example. The deployment of the military is causally associated with a major hike in homicides, or several colleagues who've looked into the adoption of the kingpin strategy. One specific strategy of decapitation of cartel leadership has created fragmentation, competition, and violence. What does this book add? Well, when you use a partisan logic to deploy the military and adopt federal intervention campaigns to roughly contain work with subnational actors, you partially succeed, because they succeeded only in the short term. Now those cities like Tijuana or Juarez are just as violent as before. But you contain violence to some extent. But when you actually use the militarization and these interventions to actually punish your political nemesis, and this is the left, what you create is conditions, you create opportunities. Cartels and breakaway groups understand politics quite well. And when they realize that leftist states with leftist governors, that mayors and entire regions were strategically unprotected by the state, that's when you had the outbreak of major intercartel wars and major attempts by drug cartels to infiltrate the elections, to infiltrate municipal governments, and to develop subnational criminal governance regimes in which they would just control not just taxation, local violence, economic activity, so on and so forth. So these dynamics that happen, dynamics that are endogenous to war, are tightly linked to politics, to the partisan factional use of the judiciary, the police, and the military. And this had very specific consequences, not only because it was part of a punishment regime by which Calderon literally tried to blame spikes on violence on the left, went on national television to politicize this. So this was an electoral battle on top of the criminal wars, but also because cartels began moving into politics, developing subnational criminal governance regimes. These are not groups that try to take over the state nationally, but they do have political ambitions of social, economic, and demographic controls in specific regions.
Now, we've got a question from Andres Mejia in London, and he asked, could you elaborate perhaps on what has Mexico learned from and how it has been different from the experience of long-lasting democracies like Colombia and Jamaica. And I think this kind of links up with what you've just said.
So what I would say is that Mexico's learning experience has been it's been very slow. What I would say is it's possible that we haven't learned, or that political elites in Mexico haven't learned anything. It's part of the dramatic story here, and it's part of the frustration that maybe we have as academics, that you could provide lots of evidence on the potential drivers of violence, and there could be some policy implications, but there's not much learning here. So look at AMLO. He comes to power, and we don't have evidence yet, because these are events that are unfolding as we speak. But to the extent that nothing really changed in terms of the political control of the president over the Attorney General's office. Now it's not called the Attorney General's office, now it's called the Public Prosecutor's office. And the governors continue to control that, to the extent that they still control the police and they can politicize that. It's very likely that regardless of whether you have the PAN in the federal government, the PRI in the federal government, or the left in the federal government, to the extent that you don't change these structures, judicial, security structures, you are very much likely to continue reproducing these events. And this is what we have right now with AMLO, that levels of violence continue to increase, and in some states continue to increase exponentially. We're having a massive election year in Mexico, midterm elections, but a massive subnational electoral process. Last year was 2018 was not just a federal, it was not just a presidential election, there were tons of subnational elections. These have been very violent cycles of criminal violence. In the book, we've presented our results to the head of Mexico's Instituto Nacional Electoral. He's heard the data we provide. Over 300 lethal attacks against local authorities. He's seen the regression. He understands that there's a very close association between subnational election cycles and violence. They just say, that sounds horrible. Let's not talk about this. So at all levels of government in Mexico, elites are ignoring this. And we have the evidence to show that 2020 is likely to become one of the most violent cycles in Mexico's contemporary history for politicians, but authorities are just gonna watch. Sandra, you wanna add something on this?
I think that my answer is that there's no, as well, that there's not much that has been learned, and there are other episodes of Mexican recent violent history. There's also evidence that there hasn't been much learned in terms of what happened, for example, with autodefensas, right? With vigilantism in Mexico. There's a lot that could be learned from Colombia in terms of how important it is about the way that these groups are being controlled, in terms of what we've said before, in terms of the police reforms, but that hasn't been part of the agenda. Unfortunately, what we're seeing right now is a lot more political polarization that would, given our argument and evidence, doesn't seem like a good condition for a good recipe in the long term.
One of the things I'm hearing both of you tell us is that one of the links between politics and criminal violence is to the extent that the old regime, or the transition to a new regime, doesn't deal with the repressive capabilities of the old regime and the continuation of those, a country could be setting itself up for a major wave of criminal violence that Guillermo is telling us that no one wants to talk about for a variety of reasons. The second thing I'm hearing is there's now, as we all know, a push in comparative politics for studying authoritarian regimes. And one of the things both of you seem to be saying is the structure of authority of that old regime, especially its repressive policing capabilities, has long-term implications. So that's another way to emphasize this point. Now, I just want to make sure that our audience understands a couple of questions. So one is, what's the difference between a criminal war and a civil war? There's a literature in IR and in comparative about civil wars. What's the distinction you're drawing here?
So one of the things that I think Guillermo has already alluded to is how, unlike armed rebel groups who typically fight civil wars to remove national governments and to establish a new political regime, drug cartels are not attempting to do that, right? They're drug cartels and their criminal associates instead have their eye on national power, but not really to establish a new regime, but to start the factors of national governance, to establish controls at the local level, because as we say in the book, organized crime is a chain of local operations. It's in that way that organized crime can establish controls and can operate globally. So it is of national governance what they're looking for, not to govern, but to establish controls.
Okay.
But recognizing that that organized crime groups have those goals is very important, and to that extent, it is important to take some of the insights from the Civil War literature to understand how is it that the power that they have acquired can really transform local political orders in the same way that rebel groups have done in the context of the Civil War.
So this is a fundamental difference. If in Black America of the 20th and 19th century, the left and the right wanted the state to push an ideological project, what you're suggesting is these criminal gangs are interested in sort of rotting the tree from the inside, but leaving the formal executive alone, just corrupting, undermining places below. If I understand you correctly,
So it's more than corrupting. It's becoming local de facto rulers, penetrating elections, municipal governments, clusters of municipal governments. What do they do when they are able to penetrate these governments? Well, they take control over the local police, the municipal police. They take control over the property registry. They take control over specific positions in local governments who regulate those who regulate local businesses. They try to take over natural resources. They move into the exploitation of natural resources, logging, the illicit extraction of gas, so on and so forth. So what we're seeing is the development, to use Anna Horner's language, not of rebelocracies, but of criminal governance regimes. Now, I would say a few fundamental differences. Sandra alluded to one, which is they don't seem to want to take power nationally. So there's no ambition there. There's really no evidence of that. They want to control so far, but it's a long so far. It's a long so far. And there's good theoretical reasons for why they don't want to go farther than that. So I would just add a couple of them. One of them is that you don't know, I mean, it's very unlikely that El Cartel de Sinaloa will become El Partido del Cartel de Sinaloa or El Partido de los Zetas. We don't see that. And to that extent, the time horizons, the FARC becomes a political party. The FMLN becomes a political party. But El Cartel de Sinaloa does not. And there's very compelling theoretical, conceptual, and empirical reasons for why that does not happen. It's very rare. Angelica Duran-Martinez is doing a book on truces, but we don't have peace negotiations among cartels, private militias, and states. We typically don't see these actors becoming political actors. As Ben Lessing has insisted, it's very unlikely that they defeat the state. So they may gain local controls, but they have short-term horizons, and that's why Sandra was saying they tend to be more predatory, because the long-term horizon, as Olson mentioned, this idea, the metaphor of roving bandits becoming stationary bandits through political institutions. So roving bandits that eventually become kings or rulers, that's very unlikely to happen institutionally for many of these groups. And that's why there's no international law of war that protects many of these actors. So there's no laws that protects many of these actors. And that's a fundamental difference between civil wars and criminal wars. But we insist in the book, these are wars because the state is fighting militarily these groups. These groups have their private militias to fight back. There's turf wars. Sometimes the state in Mexico fights, or cartels and the private militias fight symmetric wars, not necessarily asymmetric wars. They're confronting them because they're a la par in terms of military power. The Zetas were, in the end, the most powerful private militia in Mexico. In the end, was a group of defectors, of the elite members of Mexico's military. They were fighting indigenous peoples in the South. They got bored, and eventually they were recruited by the narcos. These are people who had the same, Fabrice, you know, you study Guatemala, you know this well. They had the same level of training as the Caiviles. When the Zetas moved to Guatemala, the partnership was with the Caiviles. So we're talking about that level of specialist in violence with the highest level of training that were fighting these wars.
We have a question. Just let me briefly present it, Sandra, but I do want you to make your point. We have a question from Rebecca Hansen, whether transitional justice efforts should be not only investigating those who've done obviously political acts of violence, but also those who've done criminal acts of violence. Should we rethink, if I understand her question, the way we think about transitional justice?
I just wanted to go back, Fabrice, to one of the first points by Guillermo that you were helping us better explain about what is different between civil wars and criminal wars, or what is different between rebel groups and criminal groups. That this is not only about corruption, because this is not about buying off a politician. This has gone way beyond that, right? This has been about groups actually imposing their preferences, not with an ideological agenda in mind, but with the idea of being able to exert control to a greater extent, to being able to get access to public resources, right? To getting able to have information that they wouldn't have otherwise, to actually enact certain types of public policies in terms of security. So that's why it's not really, I just wanted to emphasize that it's not about corruption, that it is about imposing their own will. But I think that thank you so much to Rebecca Hansen for her question, because I think Guillermo has a new research project that goes exactly into the logic of transitional justice for particularly criminal violence.
Let me quickly add, Sandra, thank you for bringing up the topic of corruption, because we did have a question about that. So I think you addressed that very nicely. Guillermo, please.
So for this book, as we've been discussing, transitional justice is a scope condition. So Mexico is a country that transitioned to electoral democracy, thin democracy, illiberal democracy, no transitional justice mechanism, no security sector reform, no judicial reform. So as a result, it's a most likely case to have experienced the politicization of crime, and again, this intimate interaction between crime and politics. Now, I think it's a crucial question. I think if you look, and this is as Sandra was saying, it's part of I hope in a year and a half this book is out, but it really looks into, if you think about what distinguishes countries like, say, Brazil, Honduras, with very high levels of violence, Mexico, from others, Chile, Argentina, even Peru, homicide rates that are significantly lower. What we're arguing in that research agenda is that one of the key issues is whether they adopted or not the transitional justice process, truth commissions, trials, to expose, punish many of these specialists in violence. They enter into a different trajectory of development, not as violent as Mexico, Brazil, or Honduras, which countries that did not have any transitional justice process. But I think one of the key questions is, Fabrice, I'm going to use this language that you're using. It's what do you do with coercive power? how do you control specialists in violence in democracy? And I think that's the key problem in Mexico, but it's also the key problem in Brazil, the key problem in Honduras, the key problem, and even in countries that adopted transitional justice processes, Chile.
We seem to have lost Guillermo. Let's give him another couple seconds. Perhaps Sandra, you could pick up or address something related.
Yeah, no, so Guillermo, Juan Albarracina, Elucidates Cornea have a great initial article that I think addresses Rebecca Hansen's question from the Journal of Peace Research. And what they are arguing exactly is that those countries that go into the transitional justice route have been able not only to contain human rights violations, which is something that we have seen from past literature, but actually contain criminal violence. And that's where Guillermo's new research project with Juan and Lucia goes into, because as he said, we're only dealing with this as a scope condition. And what they aim to do with this new project is understanding how is it that some countries have been able to deal with violence with better results.
Yeah, yeah.
As it is the case, for example, in Guatemala right now, with the CICIG that they have, that's another project with by Guillermo, with Camilo, New Orleans, where they have been working on understanding exactly how is it that just the mechanism of the CICIG, so sort of a transitional justice mechanism, right, has been able to contain violence. So that's something that I would say we're not able to address in this book, but that there is new extensive evidence on how it is able to contain also criminal violence.
I think we're up to about 5 minutes, 6 minutes left, Sandra. And of course, I've got plenty of questions, but one that I really think the two of you or you could address, and especially since you're in Mexico City now, is how is AMLO, this new president, well, not so new anymore, this president who has a majority in the Senate and the House, the first president since 2000, who gets to run a unified government, who claims to have a solution for what he considers to be the important problems at least. How is he addressing the drug war? Is he doing anything different than Calderon?
Yeah, well, so I guess we have sort of been referring to that in parts of the conversation. One of the I guess disillusionments of this administration is that there was a different kind of discourse of how it would be handled. There was even an encounter that López Obrador had with victims, starting to think about a transitional justice route for Mexico, and thinking of mechanisms actually into thinking about the reform for crucial institutions to address security and judicial processes. However, this hasn't been the case. There's not also even the idea of a preventive strategy has been out. That is not something that we're seeing being actually exercised. The idea of abrazos, no balazos hasn't actually been close to reality in any way. What would be crucial would be to dismantle protection networks, and that hasn't been really the idea behind the latest policy. The idea of more effective checks on the military and the police, that hasn't been the case either, because what we've seen is also an extension of of Guardia Nacional, so another kind of militarized strategy. And there has been a failure to reform the sources of the state power that intertwine with crime, and within democratic practices. And so this, in the context of huge political polarization that has been growing in Mexico for the past 2 years, this 2 years that he has been in power, there has been major polarization. And that is something to worry about in terms of how some policies are being handled. The coordination or conflict that may exist with between co-partisans and those that are not, right? Maybe we're not seeing as the nemesis that we could see between the PAN and the PRD before, but there is a wide confrontation with opposition governors in general right now that we've seen just in the past few days on how opposition governors have actually allied against the current administration, and that is, I would say, very bad news, right, for the trends in violence and the policy to attend violence in Mexico. So I guess those are what would be the concerns, because we haven't seen in practice a radical change in the type of policy to address crime. The preventive strategy, the transitional justice strategy has been very far away from this administration.
So this is, if I understand you, seems to be a continuation of the past. And that's, I guess, depressing. I think perhaps on this note, we've had this incredibly rich conversation. It's a pity that cyberspace has interfered with the presence of Guillermo here, but thankfully this book was co-authored, so we have you to thank, and we will thank Guillermo later. And I want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon, and I can only recommend that you please go out, read this book, buy this book, recommend it to your library. I think we all have a lot to profit from this book. Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Fabrice. I hope everybody enjoys the book. Thank you so much.